we have the brand new Sony 12-24 f2.8 lens, and we're going to the weirdest place in the state of Connecticut. We're also going to compare it against the 12-24 f4 lens to see if you really need that extra stop, and against the 16-35 f2.8 to see how much of a difference going out to 12 millimeters really makes. This is Holy Land, USA, one of the few places where I might be able to get some landscape photos that actually show how to use this 12mm lens. Some people think of super wide angles as letting them get closer to subjects, but for me it's really about controlling the proportion of the foreground to the background. So take these three crucifixes here. I can either get close and shoot them at 12mm and distort them a little bit and show a ton of background, or I can step back and show them at 24mm and I get a totally different picture. And as a landscape photographer, the ability to control the foreground and background is really powerful. So that's why you might want 12mm, but the question is, do you want the 12mm f2.8 with its extra weight and price, or are you happy with the 12mm f4? Let's do a side-by-side comparison at some place with a little more detail. What do you think of Holy Land, USA, man?
It's pretty holy. I like it.
First, let's compare the 12-24 f2.8 GM to the 12-24 f4G to see if you really get any extra sharpness or contrast. Looking at it without zooming in, we can see a little bit more contrast out of the f2.8 lens, so maybe you do get something for your money. Zooming in to check the details, maybe there's a bit more sharpness at the center, but it's not a whole lot. Checking the corners, I do generally see more detail out of the more expensive f2.8 GM lens. I turned 180 degrees to photograph the city to see if the extra distance and atmospheric conditions would remove any benefits. Zooming in, and we can see downright creepy amounts of detail. For example, you can read the words on this ship's sign, and indeed they do look slightly more legible on the f2.8 lens than the f4 lens, but the difference isn't much. Zooming into 24mm, the difference is a little more obvious. Here we can see significantly more contrast and sharpness out of the more expensive GM lens. In the corners, the f2.8 lens is significantly sharper. Now let's compare the 12-24 GM versus the 16-35 GM. Checking the center sharpness, here the results seem indistinguishable. Let's check corner sharpness. Here it's close, but the 16-35 GM actually does a little bit better. So I guess if you're shooting within the 16-35 range, the 16-35 f2.8 GM is the better option. Compare those same two lenses at 24mm. Here the 16-35 is significantly better than the 12-24, probably because the 12-24 is at the extreme end of its range, while the 16-35 is right in the middle. At 24mm, the corners on the 12-24 start to get a little weird. They look better on the 16-35. Therefore, if you plan to shoot only within the 16-24mm range, the 16-35 is a better option. If you need to shoot from 12-16mm, your only option is the 12-24. Zooming in on the chip sign shows it is indeed much more readable on the 16-35, just verifying the earlier results. Sorry, I'm dressed like a dad at a barbecue today. Here's a good example of how I might use that zoom to control the size of two relative subjects, this statue up close and the cross far in the distance. Check out what it looks like at 12mm, 16mm, and 24mm. By moving closer to this foreground subject, I'm able to keep it the same size while drastically controlling how big the crucifix is in the background, despite the fact that it's actually much bigger than this statue. Notice that I'm alone now. The girls couldn't handle it because it's just way too hot for them. It's 78 degrees. I love how using 12mm and being able to get really close creates these incredible effects in those clouds. It also allows me to crop out things like that no trespassing sign. For this test, I'm using what I consider to be the ultimate landscape camera, which is the Sony a7R IV with its 60 megapixels and like crazy dynamic range. It is actually super hot today, sweating. I know a lot of people got into mirrorless because they wanted to reduce the weight that they were carrying while traveling.
This lens probably isn't going to do that, but I guess it probably is lighter than any 12 to 24 millimeter that I've ever seen for SLRs. Like the Nikon super wide is just absolutely huge, and so is the Tamron DSLR lens. So it is better, but it's a lot heavier than the f4 equivalent. So let's fast forward into astrophotography and see if you actually need that extra stop of light.
Look, I'm not going to get good pictures of the stars tonight. I'm in suburban Connecticut on a super humid night and the moon is almost full. But I can get star pictures because that's one of the key benefits of this 12 to 24 f2.8. Compared to the 12 to 24 f4, it gathers a full stop more light, twice as much light. So the stars will be basically twice as bright, basically half the noise that you would get. Compared to the 16 to 35 f2.8, they would both gather about the same light, but to go from 16 millimeters to the super wide 12 millimeters provides you a wider angle of view so you can see the entire movement of the Milky Way. And that's really the focal length I like to be at for that sort of Milky Way photography. 16 is always a little too tight. Usually I use a 14 millimeter prime, which would be a little faster, the Sigma, but I haven't found the quality to be so good. So if I could get a single super wide lens that lets me do those Milky Way shots and zooms into 24 millimeters for more terrestrial, like daytime landscape photography, it just might work. Let's take a look at what the results look like. Let's zoom into a clear part of the sky, and we can see on the left the f2.8 GM lens has significantly less noise than the f4G lens because it's gathering twice as much light. As we peer into the corner of the image, you can see the f2.8 lens captured some stars that are essentially invisible in the f4 lens, but we can also see what seems to be some distortion in the stars in the very corners, probably from shooting wide open at f2.8. Here we are in the photo studio with my least favorite model to test out how these lenses handle backlighting, because as a landscape photographer you're frequently shooting at sunrise and sunset, and sometimes I'll shoot directly into the sun to get that awesome kind of flaring effect and to show a picture with a ton of dynamic range. But if a lens has great contrast, then you see all the details nice and clear, and if the lens doesn't have good contrast and everything gets washed out and maybe you see crazy ugly flaring. So I want to see what these differences are. Looking at the results, the 12 to 24 f2.8 GM has significantly better contrast than the 12 to 24 f4 and the 16 to 35 f2.8. You can see in the photos that the backlight meant to simulate the sun blooms into the mannequin's face much more on the 16 to 35 f2.8 and the 12 to 24 GM. That's a bad sign. That means more of the light is being reflected off of the internal elements. That means that your sunset pictures are gonna just not have quite the same pop. Another special effect I like is to use the sun as a focal point by shutting the lens down to f22. This turns the sun into a starburst, radiating out at every aperture blade built inside the lens. So you see really different starbursts with different lenses. I thought the starburst from the 12 to 28 f2.8 GM looked better than the starburst on the other two. So what's the takeaway? Should you buy the 12 to 24 f2.8 GM at its outrageous price? Well, maybe. I still love my 16 to 35 f2.8, and when I do need to shoot wider than 16, I will usually shoot a panorama, just stitch together multiple pictures, and then I get less noise and more detail. So that might be a solution for you guys. But if you're capturing any kind of movement in the frame, then being able to get it in a single shot without having to shoot a panorama is a big advantage. And there's something about getting it right in camera, because then you know you got it in the field. And if that resonates with you, then yeah, the 12 to 24 f2.8 is gonna be the best lens for you, and you'll get that extra contrast and you'll get those gorgeous starbursts. For people traveling, the 12 to 24 f4 is gonna be just fine. It's a great lens, but it won't be as sharp as the 12 to 24 f2.8. And each time you'll take a picture, you'll know you're not getting quite as crisp an image as you could otherwise. If you're shooting with a Sony a7 III, a 24 megapixel camera, get the 12 to 24 f4. But if you already sank $3,500 into a Sony a7R4 with 60 megapixels, then maybe you should go for that more expensive lens. I hope you appreciate this, and I hope you appreciate unbiased,
unsponsored reviews. We don't accept free gear or money from Sony or any other camera manufacturer in order to bring you these unbiased reviews. We could make more money by accepting sponsorships from camera manufacturers, but we choose to make money by selling educational content. So I hope you'll check out our book, Stunning Digital Photography, which teaches all sorts of photographic techniques. And I hope you'll check out our books on Lightroom and Photoshop. They all include tons of free video content, lots of practices that you can go through, and if for some reason you're unhappy with any of it, we'll take a return. I also want to plug the Art and Science of Photography bundle, because if you're looking at these super wide angle lenses, that is going to take you to the next level, because the art and science video training goes deep, much deeper than we could possibly go into YouTube, where everything has to be bite-sized and a little bit clickbaity. So please check out that video training. And if you have any more questions about the 12 to 24, I'll have it for a little while longer. If I decide not to buy it, I'm still not sure. So let me know in the comments. Be sure to subscribe, that helps us out too, and give the video a like. Bye. Almost forgot to mention, you cannot attach a filter to the front element of this lens because it doesn't have screw threads, because it's too wide angle. You just can't do it. Instead, Sony gave us a slot behind the rear element where you could slide in a piece of film that you yourself cut to this custom shape. I kind of wish it was a drop-in filter, but there's clearly not room behind the rear element to do that.